Connect, the space where we challenge outdated narratives and lean into more ways of supporting neurodivergent individuals. I'm your host, Sonja, the head of the Oakley House Teachers Training and Support Center and a neurodivergence advocate, a mother of two incredible children and a professional who spent almost 2 decades walking alongside families, educators, and children on this journey. Today's guest is Jonathan Hoffenberg, a registered social worker, mental health advocate, and someone who has walked the road of neurodivergence. He's here to share his powerful story of growing up with ADHD and attending a remedial school and how that shaped his sense of self, purpose, and profession. Jonathan, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Hello, Sonia. Thank you very much for having me.
I'm just going to kick right off. Tell us a little bit more about when did you realize that you experienced the world differently?
Probably when I came to South Africa. So I was born in Israel in 1969. My mother was an English nurse. She had come out to South Africa because she specialized in polio, and she met my dad, who was a architectural student, but had been a Zionist and had fought in the Israel War of Independence and had come back to study. They fell in love, got married. They had my brother, and they ended up moving back to Israel for 14 years. But we came back to South Africa. So I came from Israel to South Africa when I was 6. And I remember going through 3 kindergartens, 3 ECD centers, because I didn't quite click with the kids, and whether it was one, Israel has a slightly different way of raising its kids, and South Africa did, but I think that was my first notion that I didn't quite fit in, as well as some of the other kids, and that was very much confirmed when I went to primary school. Yeah, so probably around the age of 6 or 7.
And then, Jonathan, I assume that you were probably diagnosed if you, you went to remedial school, which we'll get to just now, but did you
Yeah.
get a formal diagnosis? How was that
So
process?
so the story goes that my mother said that I was born in a hospital that was right next to a mental health facility. And she always joked that one of the leaving psychotic spirits had left the mortal realm and had descended into my body. Because apparently, when I was born, the doctor took one look at me and said, "That's a hyperactive child." And bear in mind that back then, there was no such thing as ADD or ADHD. It was called hyperactive syndrome. And so I was diagnosed as being hyperactive from a very early age. Um, and there was always a question of that he's a very boisterous and bouncy and loud, and at sometimes obstreperous child. I always got on really well with my teachers, but never with my peer group. But really, where the issues of needing remedial came in as I was going through HA Jack, which was a government, what would now be a Model C school in Johannesburg. So I went to school in Joburg, and the school just couldn't handle me. They at grade, so I was the grade 1, grade 2, and then we went into the standards. But at grade 2, moving into standard 1, my reading ability and my pencil grip and all of that was still that of a grade 1 learner. And I think they just found me really disruptive. And so they sent me to an amazing psychiatrist called Gerald Fenster. And he was the one who went, okay, this kid not only has ADHD, but he probably also has dyslexia. And so it was recommended that I went to Bella Vista, which was a tiny remedial school um, in Johannesburg, kind of near the Wanderers Cricket Club, if anybody knows their cricket. Yeah.
Okay, so Bella Vista's been around for a very long time.
Yeah.
Um, and then how did the learning environment support or hinder your growth after now going, maybe before going to the remedial school and then after, how did you experience the learning environment?
So one of the things that fascinates me about ADHD, especially as I've gone into my professional life, and obviously, my sense is that I think that with some people with ADHD, your sense of memory can be very different. Um, I'm very much an audio. I don't forget songs, for example, and often music lyrics. But as my wife is often mentioning to me, often social interactions, it's like my brain goes, it's so full of uh, science fiction and geek and trivia facts that it doesn't have space for a lot of the other stuff. But I can remember in primary school, those first 3 years of primary school, I didn't get on with my peers. I loved learning, but I felt very rejected by them. I would spend most of my um, break sitting on the stairs, kind of feeling completely isolated. Now I look back, I realize that you know, I was a boisterous. I had very few boundaries. I would go quickly into anger. I have one dear friend who still is my friend from back then. And he says this, his memory of first meeting me was of this little grade 2 kid who was taking a child that was two standards above him and swinging him around his kind of head and smashing into. So I had a tendency of kind of getting into fights and being bullied. And I think it was that, not being able to listen, not understanding boundaries, maybe not
Mm.
social cues. And so I went from quite a hectic primary school, and Bella Vista was, I definitely remember feeling the stigma of I'm going to a remedial school, but it was
Okay.
such an oasis. The class sizes were tiny, the teachers were kind of caring, but there were only often five of us in the classes, and there would be like three grades. So it would be like 15 kids in a grade. Um, and it was the first time that I was really making social interactions. Um, and I do have some memories of how they're teaching, but for me, the big lesson was that suddenly I was able to socialize, and suddenly I was getting
Mm.
support for that socialization.
Jonathan, I think what you're saying there is really important in the context of ADHD. I did a radio interview on Sunday on autism, ASD, and they spoke about the overlap sometimes between autism and ADHD and the differences between the two,
Mm,
and then the diagnosis. And usually, when you say struggling to make friends and social difficulties, people immediately jump to autism. But what you are saying now, and from my experience as well in the 20 years that I worked with children who are neurodivergent, is there's also a very important or difficult social component to children with ADHD as well.
yeah. Look, I think the thing is the push and pull factors, and the thing that I've always said to clients and to parents of kids that have been diagnosed is it's as much the factors that you present as also how society treats you. And while South
Mm.
African society is a lot better in dealing with diversity than it used to be, we still have a very rigid education system that suits only a certain type of kid. We have a very easy way to other different kids as if it's their fault, whilst it's as much the inability of the flexibility of the system as it is with the kids. And I think the other thing that I think has been a blessing for me is because I'm both someone with neurodivergent, but also someone who's professionally worked with neurodivergent. I've seen how quite dramatically the the sector, the interest has changed. I mean, if I think of how autism used to be seen as these two narrow classifications, you were either the useful kind of autism, and then you got a fancy German name, or you were the not so useful form
Other
of
one,
autism.
yeah.
And the other one, with these two baskets. And I think in future we're going to have an understanding that neurodivergence is really a spectrum. And whilst I don't think that ADHD is the same as autism, I think that there are a lot of neurodivergence that kind of fits there, that are all of us people that are just viewing, perceiving, and navigating a world that's quite different from the so-called norm.
Yes, I fully agree with you. I think we're definitely moving towards, or I'm hoping maybe that we're
Yeah,
moving towards a place where we can see it as neurodivergence, and not necessarily these isolated labels,
yeah.
diagnoses, such as ADD and ADHD, because there's so much overlap. And so, I mean, previously seen as comorbid conditions, but
They're
actually,
horrible terms, aren't they? I
they're
mean,
horrible.
the language we use is shocking.
I know,
Comorbidity.
no, I
Oh,
fully agree. So all these differences, and there's so much overlap that it's sometimes very difficult to diagnose. Well, if you look at me, I certainly have some ADHD tendencies or traits, but I'm not ADHD. And I can
yeah.
be socially awkward, but I'm not autistic, or things like that. So I think we're definitely all hoping moving towards just seeing it as neurodivergent and then looking at the individual and their needs. So speaking of that, Jonathan, did you said there was definitely some sort of a stigma around going to a remedial school. As a
Yeah.
child, did you internalize any labels that were placed on you at the time?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think a lot of I mean, I especially think with ADHD, because ADHD, unlike autism, where you're obviously a special needs kid in a sense, and obviously there are degrees to it, but ADHD is often gone like you're a normal kid and there's just something wrong with you, you know,
Yeah.
and you just need a little bit of help, and you can be like all the other kids. And even the way that some of the professional literature will talk about that people outgrow ADHD. I don't think you ever outgrow ADHD. I think you just internalize coping mechanisms
Mm,
much better, and certainly the way that it's treated, and the factors that are important for its treatment have also come a long way. But in terms of your question, I definitely internalize the this is a lazy kid, this is a disruptive kid. um I mean, I know that probably one of your later questions is, what do you wish you knew about ADHD early on that you know now? I wish somebody had explained to me, and especially my parents, um, about rejection sensitivity dysmorphia, because I
mm,
definitely developed RSD, and it took me many years and some therapy and a lot of kind of pain to kind of work through a lot of that. So I think how you're treated as a kid, how you're rejected as a kid, definitely scars you. But I think at the same time, ADHD has got some amazing superpowers that I know we'll talk about later. And the one thing that I've been blessed is I'm able to cycle through an emotive state very quickly. Yes, I can get angry quickly, but I can move out of anger very quickly,
mm.
which is often surprising
Mm.
to people. And that was one of the lessons I needed to learn as well, because I thought everybody could get over things at the same speed that I did. And I know that people hold grudges. Yeah.
I think you've answered my next question, Jonathan. I wanted to ask you, how is your understanding of ADHD changed as you've gotten older?
So it's I mean, it used to be called hyperactivity. It was very much seen as a chemical imbalance. There wasn't an understanding of the role. Well, there was, I mean, if I think of, so for example, my mom never allowed me to have red food coloring. And I remember, because other kids used to get the red Viennas, and all I wanted was to have one of those red Viennas, because mum would never allow me to have those. So she definitely got the sense that it was also influenced by food. But I don't think that, like, now I'm very conscious that I need protein in the morning to get my brain
Mm.
up and running, you know. So to me, diet plays a huge role. I wish somebody had told me that exercise plays a big role, because as a kid with also a wandering eye and low attention span, I was always shocking at the group sports in that middle school. I hated cricket. I was okay at rugby, but I never got into sports, which meant that I never learned the joy of how good it feels when you've really used your body. And again, ADHD, ADD kids, it's your flow work, it's your exercise. You must be in your body. If you're too much in your mind, there's a real disconnect that often leads to the kind of anxiety and the emotional outbursts. I wish that I definitely knew that medication wasn't the only thing. And there's a story that my parents used to tell me. I mean, they've both passed now, but they said at the age of 12, I walked into their bedroom and said, "That's it. I'm not doing Ritalin and Tofranel anymore." So I was on Ritalin and Tofranel. I can't remember why I was so keen on not doing it, but at one point I walked in and said, "I don't need the drugs anymore." And like idiots, they said it was okay. In the same way that I was at Bella Vista for 3 years, and when I came in, I had the reading ability of 2 grades below me, and when I left, I had the reading ability of 2 grades above me. And like a lot of ADHD kids, um, there are aspects of my IQ test and stuff that score kind of gifted. So I was always seen as a very bright kid. And so there was this notion of this kid is okay, he can normalize it into normal school, which now I realize was the wrong thing to do.
So, Jonathan, you have mentioned earlier that you wish that maybe someone would have explained to you, or your parents would have explained to you better. Um, and I'm laughing because you mentioned the red food coloring, and I certainly remember when I grew up, red food coloring was a big thing. I mean, I grew up Afrikaans, and we called it Jannie Verjaar cool drink, and that's what we had, but we weren't allowed to have that. Um, and and then tartrazine was a big thing, and
Yeah.
MSG was a big thing. Not
Yeah.
necessarily an understanding of how food affects you as a child, but those three were big no-nos. So I remember that. And what do you think, or how do you think parents have shifted from them to now in terms of their understanding around ADHD? I mean, you
Well,
obviously, you in your experience with your own parents and now working with parents and children.
Mm. Well, I think this is both a positive and a negative. And one of the things that I often say to parents is, when my parents had me, there was one book on parenting, and it was called, Dr. Spock. And now there is a plethora of parents. I think, and as somebody who's not only studied social work but also sociology, I think that we're seeing a group of children that are having a fundamentally different childhood than children have had for the 300,000 years that we've been around as a species. In that, and that means it's completely untested that we're growing up in an information age. We're growing up where children are growing with a tablet constantly in their hands. But the big thing is, I think of, and I don't blame my parents. I think they were so lacking information. I think my father was a 1950s architect. He was building a practice. He was always working. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. My mom was amazing. I think probably she had a bit of the ADD, ADHD. I probably got it from her because now, of course, we understand how genetically it kind of flows. And I think they were trying their best, but I think parents now have so much access to information, almost too much information. And
Yeah.
that's the negative. How do you critically kind of find yourself? And also, especially around issues of neurodiversity and teens, and I think of also around issues of gender fluidity and stuff. Sometimes it means that your kids are more informed than you are, which means that they're able to out argue you. And, especially when it comes to issues of kind of treatment and medication and that type of stuff. So I think parents are in a much more informed, but I think they're in a much more kind of, dare I say, contentious. And the fact that we're going into a political cycle that is so vested away from facts and more in populism, and you see
Mm.
the stupidity of things like autism being linked to vaccinations and that type of stuff. So I think parents and kids are in a better space, but I think it comes at a cost.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I went a little bit off topic there, Jonathan, but I want to go back to you. and ask you, do you still carry any of the messages, whether it was positive or negative, from that time, or any of the messages or label or perceptions that was formed around you as an individual? Are there any of those now that you have got your own knowledge and your practice and things? Are there any of those that you still carry?
Well, I can think of three. The first one was, I think it might have been my first session with Gerald Fenster, who was this amazing psychiatrist. And he read me this passage. And it was a passage, and it says, the children of today are incredibly rude and disrespectful, and they don't follow the ways of their elders, and they just want to do their own thing. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, I'm not doing verbatim. And he said to me, where do you think that comes from? And of course, I said, that comes from now. And, parents just don't understand. And he said, well, actually, that's Socrates, who was a Greek philosopher, like 3,000, 4,000 years ago. And his point is that there is always that part of that developmental stage. There is always part of that ego foundation and identity creation, where you're adrift and where the tide comes in and you feel at home, and when the tide goes out, you feel lost. So I suppose that's the first thing. The second thing was, in Bella Vista, we used to have cigarette boxes. I'm sure Bella Vista doesn't want this mentioned, but back then, I mean, everybody smoked
Very
everywhere.
long ago, doesn't matter.
Yeah, very long ago. And I remember there would be these packs of 30 Benson and Hedges, and you would carry these 3 cigarette boxes of the words you didn't know, the words that you were struggling with, and the words that you did know. And I remember from that lesson that mastery is important, that focus more on the box of words that you know than the box that you don't know, because the condition we have, the world and yourself, and I think we internalize the criticism, we become terrible critics of ourselves. And that, I think the lesson that it also took me a while, and it only really happened when I got back to varsity the second time. So I knew I was smart, but I knew that I had issues. And instead of knuckling down and finding proper coping mechanisms and study methods and understanding what type of learner I am and stuff, in my arrogance, I thought my intelligence will carry it through. So I matriculated. I came straight down to UCT, wanting to become a child psychologist. And of course, I discovered beer and marijuana and left-wing politics, and failed my first year and failed my second year, and went to a whole Marxist thing of wanting to work with my hands. And I was studied as a chef, worked as a chef, ran a cooking school. And so I came back to study social work at the age of 30. And in coming back to study social work at the age of 30, then there were computers. Then there was actually a support system where I could get extra time. Then I realized that actually maybe I should occasionally use Ritalin when I really need to kind of focus. And I got my 3-year degree in 2 years in the Dean's Merit List, and with, class medals and that type of stuff. But I had to convince myself. I knew I was intelligent, but I knew the rest of the world didn't see that. And I needed to get that degree with distinction to go, okay, the narratives that you're telling yourselves, some of them are bull SH1T, and some of them aren't. And learn to be a critical thinker with yourself as well.
Yeah, that's very important. Hey, figure it out for yourself.
Yeah.
It sounds like you almost, Jonathan, had to prove it to yourself as well.
No, very much. Yeah.
Not just to the world, more to yourself.
Yeah, because that's when you prove it to yourself. I think, and this is the struggle, and this is the thing I say about to parents as well, is all children when they're young want to fit in. They want to be liked by their peers and their teachers. And this is what makes me so sad about little ADHD boys, is they come with their rambunctious energy because they really mean well. And it's labeled, this is a troublemaker. And the small boy then goes, so you're giving me a naughty label. Okay, if that's the label you want me to wear, I'm going to do the best I can and be the naughtiest boy because that's what you want from me. And I think that's the thing is you need to recognize that it's the outside world might be giving you a label. And I think that label can be useful. I mean, in my work, I've often found that, especially when children are completely adrift, when they get that diagnosis, it can actually often be a positive thing because, okay, now I know what I've got. But it's then saying to them that, look, it's a diagnosis of a basket of things. Some things fit you, some things don't. You need to define yourself. And it's only when you define yourself that you're truly going to be happy. You need to love yourself before anyone will love you.
Yeah. Well, my next question to you, Jonathan, is in your practice today, how do you support children who remind you of yourself? And I think you've mentioned two already. The cigarette box stories, I mean, it's the box that you carry and that you focus on that is
Oh,
important. Um, and the same with your last story. Is there anything else, or what else do you do to support the children? Maybe, I mean, I often find that we reflect on ourselves and then we give the children the support that we never had. Um,
yeah,
so
yeah.
how do you support the children?
And look, I mean, and as a therapist, you obviously need to be careful about over identification. And so I'm normally quite careful about it. But some of the lessons that my life has taught me is, one, the importance of positive role models. And I love my dad. I think my dad tried his best. He took me to Saturday movie, a war movie that we would go see, that we would kind of slightly talk about, but that's how we kind of communicated. But and he was worried about me for until Alzheimer's turned him into this cuddly bear. But as an adult, he would take me out to lunch because he worked overseas, and he would say like, "How are you doing?" I could see that he was worried that I was working for NGOs and not earning enough money and that type of stuff. But
Mm,
so I think that older male recognition and support is important, especially for boys. But I think increasingly for girls kind of as well. Then other lessons, I think it's finding your allies, and that your allies aren't necessarily going to be always with you. But if you found someone that supports you, lock onto them and use them the best. I think we're so embarrassed about ourselves and we feel so kind of broken that when we find someone who wants to help, we don't accept that help and accept the help when it's being
yeah,
kind of given. Celebrate your milestones. Practice. I mean, the five things that I say to all of my clients is medication plays a role, diet, as we've mentioned, plays a role, exercise plays a role. One thing, and I wish I could say that I do it every day, but one thing that has made a big impact on my life is meditation. And I think some form of meditation, um, if you're religious, it can be linked to prayer. If you're not religious, it can be, it can be mandalas, it can be any form of meditation. And meditation can also be something like painting miniatures or being on the rowing machine, what's known as flow work, where your mind is
mm,
both engaged, but it's able to kind of wander. I think that's critical for people with neurodivergence. And then the last one is kind of coaching, and that's finding, and that coaching doesn't necessarily only have to be from a professional. Really value your friends. If you're
yeah.
neurodivergent, you want to find those friends who can call you on your nonsense, who can say,
Nonsense.
actually, you've overreacted there, and you need to, kind of rethink it.
Mm. Someone that can help you reflect, I
Yeah.
think is
Yeah.
really
And it will be
important.
honest and sometimes
Yes,
tell you the stuff that you don't want to hear, you
yes,
know?
absolutely. I think, Jonathan, as you're speaking there, parents, obviously, us as individuals have come a very long way when it comes to neurodivergence and understanding, especially, I want to say the main ones, the most popular ones, ADHD and ASD. But I can definitely see that there's still a lack of understanding. As you said,
Yeah.
as with when you were little, there is still this perception sometimes that he's a normal or neurotypical, call it what you want, child, because cognitively he's fine. If only he can sit still. If only they're not as naughty. If only they would listen. And not really
He's not
understanding
disciplined enough. Yeah.
exactly. Yes, exactly. If there's more discipline, if there's more structure, if there's more, then if they're more well behaved, then they would be normal or typical. So I think there's still that stigma to ADHD specifically, because a lot of the times there's no cognitive delay, so they
Yeah.
seem typical.
Yeah.
Jonathan, what do you say to parents whose children has been diagnosed if they come to you?
Well, the one thing that I say to parents, and this is the irony of being a parent, we both want our child to be special and normal, but just in the ways that we want them to be. Nobody wants an average child when it comes to results. You don't want a child that's coming C's for everything. You want a child that's going to be exceptional, but in the exceptional ways that you want them to be. And that's one thing that I poke fun at parents in kind of doing, because invariably they go, "Oh, why is my child normal?" And you go, "Really? Do you really want a normal child?" Because that means that it comes with someone who isn't going to have extreme emotions, but those extreme emotions also mean that the love that you get from an ADHD kid, the affection that you get from someone with autism, who so rarely shows affection. I mean, I've had autistic, the parents of autistic children break down in tears when their child simply allowed themselves to be held because they put the work in. So sometimes normal isn't what you kind of want it to be. And then it's also, and this spills into, so my day-to-day profession is working at the parent center, and we work with parents, and a lot of parents are coming with often discipline issues. And the first thing we do is we get them to reflect on their own childhood. Um, and I think that's not only important because of how hereditary and genetic a lot of these things are, but I think that we are a culture in all of our diversities and in all of our cultures that have all come out of very patriarchal, misogynistic, authoritarian kind of bases. And often when I'm taking family histories, I'll say to people, and they'll go, "Well, this is the first time ADHD has come in my household." And I'll say, "Well, tell me about your household." And they say, "Well, I had a great uncle, and everybody called him crazy, and he was really unconventional, and he went off and he started, this bicycle shop in Onrust, and it was the first bicycle shop." And I go, if you're wondering where it manifests,
Yes.
so that's, we had a historical culture where women would suppress so much and where boys would channel it into things, and often a lot of the ADHD boys of the past were the ADHD boys that went on to become great engineers and mechanics and people who are really good at their hands. I think of a lot of dyslexics, who go into practical things. So it's about getting parents to explore their history, their wounding, and often how we all, as you said, we reflect in our children how we wish we were kind of parented, and to practice kind of empathy and compassion. And if they can set that baseline of, "I just want my child to thrive in whatever way they can thrive," you often see such amazing breakthroughs when we just
Yeah.
let go of these predefined notions of what a successful child should be.
Yeah, I can definitely echo that, Jonathan. When I sit with parents as well, we reflect first on our own biases, and I often ask to parents, they would make certain rules, and if you ask them why, often they don't even know why. It's
Yeah,
just because that's the way it's been. But that's the way my dad did it. And if they really sit and unpack it, they realize, but that wasn't necessarily the best way.
yeah.
Um, so yes, I always say it starts with us first.
And
So
you look
thank
at
you for that.
generations
Yes.
of men that were so scarred by the trauma of things like army and narrow notions of masculinity, of women who were scarred by gender-based violence, but also how narrow society wanted them to be. And I think that sadly, one of the sad lenses of um, anything in the the biomedical model, is it treats the masculine as the default, which means that all the tests were for boys, and all the diagnosis. And it's been really heartening for me to see how we're having a much greater understanding of how ADHD manifests in women, for example.
Yes,
Um,
absolutely.
and the importance, and how often you have, and most of my work with adults is often with men around middle passage work, but I've had some work with women, and just something like how neurodivergence often means that they've switched off their connection with their bodies. And that means things like, sexual fulfillment and all of these things that we need as functional, holistic people,
Humans.
that we think that we don't deserve because we're
Mm.
different, you know.
Sure, Jonathan, that's almost a whole podcast on its own. We might get back to that.
Cool.
So from obviously we now spoke about parents and how parents have shifted or not shifted over the years. And as an educator and leaders in education, we can't always, and professionals, obviously, we can't always dictate where the kids come from. I mean, they come from
Oh.
households with their own set of rules and their own perceptions and their own beings. So, from your perspective, how can schools become a place of belonging for neurodivergent children?
I think one, it's normalizing difference, and I know that Oakley House is really amazing with that. It's recognition that, and this is one of the imagery that I often use. Your scars are the story of your life experience. They should be celebrated, not hidden away. And I think that's the thing. It's getting, I think, getting kids to journal, to use creativity, whether it's um, poems or play or movement or dance, that expresses their trauma, their longing, their hurts, so that it transcends, and so that it can be healed. But it's recognizing that you carry your scars, and your scars are important. They tell you of the battles that you've had, and the victories that you've kind of won. And I think that's an important thing that kind of schools can do. I think the other thing that especially neurodivergent schools can do, and this is obviously something that's very dear to me, is about working on the positive masculine, but also the feminine that doesn't continuously fawn. And I think if you think of those, and we used to think of fight or flight as only fight or flight, and then we talked about freeze, and it's only now that we're really talking about fawning. And I think
Mm.
fawning is a big factor in neurodivergence, especially amongst girls. That when you're feeling that anxiety, just go with it. Just be nice to the man. Just smile at the teacher. Kind of do your best. And I think that we over teach girls to be good girls, and a
Yes,
good
yeah.
girl isn't a
We teach
healthy
them to
girl.
mask.
Yeah, no,
We teach
exactly.
them to mask.
you know and I think we teach boys that, and this is a lot of the work that I do as well, obviously with feeling wheels, but also with that, you can't change emotion, you can change behavior, and that anger is not necessarily a bad thing. It's how it's expressed, it's how it's used. And that was a very valuable lesson that I learned much later in life, that I think I've seen often with boys is quite okay, that you can take that frustration and you can turn it into a good thing. So I think, schools that play that important concertina role, that at times you need to learn to work as a pack, to follow the group rules. And that doesn't mean that you lose your individuality. And there are times when you need to let your freak flag fly and be an individual, but that doesn't mean that you're not part of a collective.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. I also think, Jonathan, now as you're speaking, I'm thinking that I have recently done life coaching certification, and we're talking about the children and teaching the children to feel. But I have now, in some of my teachers' training, brought in almost getting the teachers to reflect on their own barriers and difficulties and traumas and
Mm-hmm.
life circumstances, and getting them to become vulnerable within themselves, because we work with very vulnerable children.
Yeah.
And I don't believe that we can support children who are vulnerable. I'm not saying spilling your vulnerability onto the child, but really understanding what it takes to be vulnerable, in order to support them, I think is really important.
Yeah. And children need to recognize that parents aren't perfect, teachers aren't perfect. We all are flawed. We all struggle with things. We've certainly seen in terms of my work, that COVID has had a terrible knock-on effect in terms of family dynamics. I think that when you get married to someone, you have these projections that we're going to have a normal family. So I think even a healthy relationship is tested by neurodivergence. But I've seen too many situations where, the kid is only kind of diagnosed and starts to get treatment once the marriage has fallen apart. And then you're dealing with co-parenting dynamics as well as supporting a neurodivergent. And the time when I've had, mom saying, I don't support that diagnosis, or dad saying, and then playing out their own, and the role of intergenerational trauma. I think as the Africans, as practitioners and therapists in the South African context, the level of trauma, and how trauma manifests into our society is so deeply rooted, and speaks to everything that we do. That now and again I long, it would be amazing to go and practice this in Canada, or how amazing would be to. I had a friend who emigrated in Canada. I remember going and visiting her in Calgary, and every day I'd have my cup of coffee looking out on the park, and all the kids would come and they put their school bags down at the bus stop, and they go play, and they just leave all these bags unattended. I remember going, how can they leave all these bags unattended? And then I thought, I could make a killing in Canada stealing school bags, but be living in a safe society, how that changes your mindset and that base level of anxiety. Yeah, can't be
Your
overstated.
being. Okay, we're going towards the end of this session, Jonathan. Hopefully, we'll have a few more, because you've definitely raised some very interesting things throughout this podcast. But what still challenges you? Obviously, you are very self-aware. You've had your journey as being neurodivergent yourself, and then as a professional in your profession. What still challenges you with being or having ADHD?
The rejection sensitivity, dysmorphia still challenges me. It's something that I need to uh, remind myself every day. The being a father, a husband, and working in a very senior management role, and getting the things right. So it's a bit like, um, you've got to be doing those daily maintenance chores. Are you checking your diary? Are you? I used to be really good at remembering stuff to do with work, and I'd know, work Tuesday, I've got a podcast from 5 to 6. And then I'd go home, my wife would go, what are we doing tonight? And I go, home. I'm not doing anything, because home and work are kind of separated.
Separate.
So it's integrating kind of those. I mean, as I get older, it's being more conscious of weight, it's being more conscious of, um, I mean, I think that my marijuana use was definitely a coping mechanism. I mean, I joked to myself that I went off Ritalin, and I went off Ritalin only to then take up marijuana of people that are self-medicating with marijuana and with alcohol and not telling their therapists and not telling their,
Mm.
and that's the thing. If you're not disclosing all your coping mechanisms, how are you going to integrate into a holistic life? Um, and it's finding the things. It's not necessarily finding the things that you're passionate about. It's finding the things that you're passionate about that you can stick at, because we're all magpies. We go shiny thing, bring it to the nest, ignore it. And it's the thing that I chuckle because I see it now in my kids. So, I mean, I didn't mention I have three. I used to have three boys, but my middle child has decided that they are gender fluid. So they're a them. Um, but I've got Max and he's 25. There's Noah and they are 22. And then there's Elijah and they're 13. Max was diagnosed with ADD. Noah was diagnosed with ADHD and dyslexia, and they picked up the dyslexia very late, which had a big impact on them. And Elijah, I can see elements of ADHD, but I don't think he's got some of the stuff that he's inherited from his mum. Um, but like today, Elijah was busy talking about, no, he wants to make a sniper rifle with some tubing. And he was coming and saying, Dad, where's the blowtorch? And I was saying, what do you need a blowtorch for? So it's, be curious and open and exploratory with your children, and don't always smack them down, because often in their chaos is the goodness.
Yeah, absolutely. Jonathan, you have mentioned some very I think relevant things that we don't often talk about. I think we scared to mention things like you've said, the marijuana use. We're
Oh,
scared to mention things like that, and it is a very big reality for a lot of our adolescents, for instance, self-medicating and coping mechanisms and things like that. So there goes another podcast.
but to the
So
point of, and if I think of that in Plumstead, um, probably very near where Oakley House is. I mean, if I think of Plumstead, there's a place called Cannabis, for example. But any of these dispensaries, if you go in and you ask the people, and they'll say this dope is good for ADHD. This dope is good for ADD. This dope is good for autism. This dope is, so there's not only are people using marijuana, but the marijuana industry itself is recognizing and is breeding strains and all sorts of complexities and stuff, you know.
mm,
And I do think that people need to be critical and be making informed decisions. And as a therapist, I'm very open-minded. But I think that you've got to be honest with yourself and try things and what works. But everything always comes at a cost. Ritalin is great. I still use it occasionally. It always comes with a cost. Everything has a cost to pay.
yeah, absolutely. And if I think you're talking now about let's say the marijuana use, it's often the combination of that kids are not aware of. I had one of my clients had was on anti-anxiety medication that was prescribed
Yeah,
by a doctor, and then used marijuana that was, I almost want to say, prescribed as well for ADHD or whatever, and the combination of the two
it's
had some
shocking. Yeah,
terrible side effects,
no, completely.
and
Teens should
people are
not
not
be
aware.
using and that's the thing. Teens, your frontal cortex is still, you need to be careful. And that's the thing. I think, I mean, our generation, our parents were so quick in going, no porn, no drugs, no this, no that. I think I'm hoping that parents these days are a lot more kind of open-minded. Yes, you need to know what your teens are doing, but hopefully you've got a conversation where they can come to you and say, Dad, I'm thinking of trying, so that you can have those discussions of, look, these are the, and do your research and think, and can we talk it out, because yeah, it can have very bad experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Jonathan, thank you so much. This was
Mm,
really
this
cool.
was lovely.
Um, Thank you for sharing your personal experience and reframing ADHD. I think you've mentioned so many critical topics that I think we can carry on talking for much longer. But I hope to invite you back to discuss some of these
I'd
other
love to.
things that we've touched. So
Sure.
thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and I'd love to come back.
Thank you. And then to our listeners, whether you're an educator, a parent, or on your own neurodivergent journey, I hope this episode sparks compassion and curiosity. It's an invitation to rethink how we respond to differences, to nurture our strengths, and to create spaces where belonging is freely offered. And if you would like to connect with Jonathan as a therapist, feel free to contact us, Jonathan, if you don't mind, then we will share your
Yes, by all
details.
means. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And then if this episode resonated with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Join the conversation, tag us, and let us know your thoughts. Until next time, stay kind, stay curious, and keep challenging these outdated narratives around neurodivergence. So thank you.